Dr. Iles, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. And despite our technical difficulties, I'm really excited about the conversation that we are going to have again. So, thank you so much for joining us, for coming to tell your story. Again, it's not like I get to interview people who were not only acquainted with the fathers of forest biometrics, but also help pioneer some of the sampling techniques that we use. So again, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure.
To start off, I just wanted to ask you, how did you get into forestry? What was it that sparked your interest in going to forestry school?
Well, I went to Oregon State on probation because I wasn't a good student, and asked them, they asked me what I wanted to do. I said, well, I would like to study ecology. And luckily I was saved from that because they didn't have it. They said, well, we have forestry. So I said, well, is that a good thing to do? I'm interested in, being out in the woods and stuff like that. And they said, well, they wipe out 4 out of 5 people because they work them awfully hard. And you're not a good student, so that might be a concern. And I said, well, I can work hard. And so I stuck it out at the forestry school. And after 4 years, I graduated, and I haven't had much imagination about doing anything else. So I ended up and like most of my career, I just fell into it. I don't think I've ever made an intelligent decision about what to do in my career. I just always sort of stumbled upon things.
Yeah. Again, it's interesting hearing you say that. You might be one of the most intelligent people that I've met in the business so far, and your feelings towards it probably mirrors some of the other intelligent individuals that I know, who are just very, very humble and very down to earth. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about our profession. It's full of good people.
Yes, that's been my experience. I mean, everybody, without exception, at the top of the business are lovely people, absolute gentlemen in all regards. The second level is the same, and the third and fourth levels, well, they maybe get a little full of themselves, but not at the top.
Yeah.
And these people are so approachable that getting to know them is easy, not comfortable, but easy. And they're always very good about chatting with you. And so if you make an effort, you can get to know just about everybody. And as after enough time accumulates, then it's everybody certainly that's alive still. And if you don't start early, then of course you lose the upper end of those guys. I didn't get to meet R.A. Fisher, for instance, and I didn't get to meet the elder Bruce, Don Bruce, though I knew his son. But of the people of my era, I made an effort to meet all of them, and enjoyed every single one of them. There was not a call in the bunch, not at the top. And so I think that it's not hard to do that, but it isn't something that most of us are trained to do. We're not trained to walk across the room and say, "Hi, is this seat free for dinner?" And the answer, of course, will always be, "Well, of course it is." But most of us, well, I'll go sit in the edge and talk to the other grad students. And so you miss these opportunities because first thing you know, these guys pass away. And so if you're lucky, you have somebody who will kick you in the back end and say, no, go talk to him. And don't come back until you have a really interesting discussion. And then you can say, well, Johnny Bell told me I had to come talk to you. And that was okay. I felt comfortable with that. But yes, I've met just about all of these folks and enjoyed all of them.
Right. And well, we're skipping ahead a bit, but you decided to go to grad school as well. So you finished your bachelor's. You couldn't take ecology. You did forestry, and you decided to do a master's degree in forest biometrics. And that's where you met John Bell.
Well, I met John when I was an undergrad.
Oh, okay.
And I had him for forest measurements. I tried to go into forest recreation so that I could avoid the second semester of forest measurements because I thought it was too difficult. I didn't do very well at it. And John apparently had kind of forgotten that. He always thought I did well in his class. I only got a B in his class. I checked the transcript, but he thought I thought I asked interesting questions. And so he said I'd been drafted and gone to Germany and studied nuclear weapons, but I ended up computing programming.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that, they threw me out of the Army. And John Bell said, well, you should come here and do biometrics. I said, John, I'm never good at biometrics. He said, well, that's okay. I think you could do it, but we'll pay you. Okay. So I said, well, you'll pay me. Well, I'll try. And before I knew it, I'd graduated from there. And then John said, well, there's a temporary shot at Michigan Tech for 2 years. You should go there and see if you like teaching. Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, because I don't like making decisions. So I just did what he told me. And then they threw me out of there after the 2 years was up. And I had to go somewhere. So I came back to the West Coast. Actually, Gene Esterberg was very kind to me there. He's a fabulous guy. He offered to put me through a PhD there. But I said, no, I'm a West Coast kind of guy. Mm-hmm. So I went back and I thought, well, of the places on the West Coast, I'd been to Oregon State. Washington State, I thought, was a little bit too techie and statistical, but UBC was a great place. Mm-hmm. And so I got a PhD from there. And they threw me out of that after 3 years. And I was at a conference, and this guy, Don Reimer, great guy, he worked for McMillan Bloedel, big company back here. We just happened to sit down together for lunch, and he said, I'm moving up to a manager position, and we need a biometrician. Oh, I said, well, that's what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. He said, well, why don't you take that job? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, okay. And that's how I got my job at McMillan Bloedel. It just sort of fell into these things in each case. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up being a PhD in biometrics without any real inclination or particular ability in that sort of work. And I've never been good at mathematics. But logic is what most of statistics is about. There's very little math in statistics. It's almost all logic. And the important issues are all about logic and knowing what's worth doing. Mm-hmm. So I've managed to stay in the field. And then finally, the company, after about a dozen years of wonderful experience, they decided to sell themselves and go bankrupt and sell themselves off. So everybody eventually went in layers. I was about the sixth layer down. And so I went to work with the Forest Service, who were doing the British Columbia inventory design mm-hmm. on about 250 million acres. And so they said, well, you could design the forest inventory. I said, well, okay. So I did that. And for the last 30 years, nobody's thrown me out, and I've had no place to go. So I've been doing consulting and this sort of work ever since. But in no point in there did I ever make an intelligent decision about what I should do or where I should go. That just all happened to me.
Yeah. Are you from Oregon?
Yes, I was born in Roseburg, Oregon. My family had been there for like 5 generations. Used to have a stagecoach station down there, and I was the first one really to leave. Mm-hmm. And I enjoyed it. British Columbia, where I am now on Vancouver Island, is pretty much the same. It's same kind of dark, wet forest. It grows trees really well, but it's a little brushy. Mm-hmm. But I like it. And the West Coast has always been a leader in measurements because they have so much timber. Mm-hmm. Much of it is federal and a lot of state. And so they've had a lot of inventory work down here. Mason, Bruce, and Gerard was out here. That was Don Bruce, who wrote Bruce and Schumacher book. Mm-hmm. And he was very innovative about that stuff. And my boss, Johnny Bell, was a variable plot sampler. Mm-hmm. So I became a variable plot sampler and haven't had a reason to change yet. I probably would have done modeling, except the computers were so bad in those days that they hardly did anything, and certainly nothing this is mid 60s when I went to Oregon State. So they had one terminal because the computer was in a building because you needed a whole building at that time. Mm-hmm. And I was the only one who used the terminal, had it all to myself. And so I learned to computer program at the time on a very advanced system, really. I was doing everything on disk when everybody else was punching cards. I didn't know what a card was. Yeah. So I had, for 30 years, I was able to say, well, I know where this is going. I know what we're going to be doing in 30 years because that's what I did before. Yeah. And luckily, I was in there when they were very, very new, but very innovative. Now, of course, I have no idea what's happening in computers because I don't hang around in the really innovative places anymore. I just use them.
Yeah, it's interesting. The innovative things that are happening in computers right now, I don't know necessarily that it's going to translate too well in innovation in forestry at the moment. Maybe that innovation needs to build a bit before we get there, but we'll see. I will say we have been repeating one of the one of the statements that you made at the recent Nemo Somens meeting, which is be prepared. Don't worry about what we're going to do with it. Worry about what we're going to do when it comes. So it was in reference to, I think, GIS. And so we're talking about, now inventory come from different remote sensing methods, LiDAR and drones and whatever. It's not like, what are we going to do with it now? It's like, no, what are we going to do whenever it actually works? So, and now instead of just making big data rooms to house super amounts of data, we need to think about what are those data going to look like on the other side so that we're prepared to use it whenever it's in a commercially available product.
Yes, I'm always surprised at what people remember that I said. I have to be more careful about it. It's the same thing with my children. They say, well, I remember you always used to say such and such. And I think, I never said that.
Right.
That doesn't sound like something. It sounds like something I might have said, but surely I don't remember. And why were you listening? I didn't think you were listening.
Yeah.
And yes, most of the stuff that we're doing now is 40 or 50 or 60 years old. Mm-hmm. Variable plot sampling is now 80 years old. There's still people wondering if it'll work in Brazil or someplace. And the problem for a technical person mm-hmm. is to say, now, when this works and when it's cheap mm-hmm. and when it's quick, mm-hmm. what would you do with it?
Right.
Now, that'll be 30 years, maybe 40 years. Some of the work that I did is now 50 years old, people just noticing it. So mm-hmm. when it becomes easy and cheap and clearly the case, then how will you get ready for using it? Mm-hmm. You could see that some of these things like GIS was eventually going to work, but it would be 2 or 3 sets of materials and computers, and it would be 30 years in the future. Mm-hmm. But if you thought about it, you say, well, okay, when it works and when it's basically free, mm-hmm. then what will you do? What will you do when computers are infinite speed and infinite memory, which they just about are now? Mm-hmm. When you didn't, at the time, you were saying, well, what's the maximum memory? You couldn't possibly write a program that could take more than 2K, and maybe not even that. I worked on a computer once that had 128 characters of memory. You needed to be careful and clever to use that memory, but you could see in the future that this was not going to be a problem. And when it was, what would you get ready for?
Right.
I was just reading the other day that, a typical iPhone now has on the order of 15 billion transistors in it.
Wow.
A number which is beyond my thinking. And yet I worked on things that were really, really limited. And so people used 3.1 for pi because they wanted to save memory. And many of our procedures now are built on limitations that disappeared a generation or 2 generations ago, 50 or 60 years since they were necessary or wise. And we're still being told, well, we have to do it this way. It's in the manual. I think that was the reference to what I was saying at the conference. And I've found this to be the case all the way through. We are a vast coral shoal of procedures that were laid down when our grandfathers were pooping their pants. It was just, it's incredible. And people have to break free from that. And somebody, well, we can't do that because it's too expensive. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, think about it. LiDAR is going to be free pretty soon. GPS is going to be free. Oh, no, GPS is terribly expensive. They need these stations. No, think about it. When it's free and when it's everywhere, what would you want to do? Mm-hmm. And so when we're thinking now about the way we're going to structure records and procedures, why don't we do that knowing that in 20 years, we're going to have infinite speed and infinite memory and computers are going to be nearly free. Yeah. And that's now happened. But you couldn't convince anybody of that 40 years ago. But if you thought about it, you knew it was going to be true.
Yeah, and data will be free as well. I hosted a meeting here in Mobile of some biometricians back in December of last year. And one of the questions was, when are we going to know the forest inventory on every single acre of land in the U.S.? And someone said, that's going to be 50 years from now. That's not anything happening soon. And I said, but if you look in places like Europe, like, for example, I worked in Norway, they've had LiDAR on the entire country like 3 or 4 times now. And so having this wall to wall, like, are you going to know the exact inventory? Probably not. It comes with error. It comes with model bias and all of these sorts of things. But we're getting closer. That's going to come, and that data is going to be freely available. If you look at the information that's available from, the Sentinel satellites or with Google Earth Engine or all of these things like JEDI, the data are coming. So we need to be prepared to use it whenever it's here and freely available, just like you said. So that resonated with that statement that you made.
Well, yeah, we're in a period of data inundation. It's pouring down on us.
Right.
Auxiliary information is everywhere in great depth, and we have to get rid of a lot of it just to see anything in it. And that gathering data is not a problem. Thinning it out, making sense of it, deciding what to do intelligently with it is a problem. And when people don't make the distinction between data and measurements and stuff that's immediately available, you get into quite a bit of trouble.
Yeah.
We have enormous amounts of information that works as estimates, often for free, often way too much of it. Very little that operates as measurements. And in my view, forest inventory is about measurements. You use estimates for all kinds of things, but they're not measurements, and they don't replace measurements. And people think that they do replace measurements are bound to fail rather badly. And in some cases have done them. Most of it's covered up. Large agencies who do big projects and they say, oh, this is going to be so wonderful. We're ahead of the curve. They go out and they spend huge amounts of money. And anytime a vice president authorizes $5 million to be spent, it will be a success. And everybody will line up and say, yes, sir. And at the very most you can say is, well, we learned so much from this apparent failure. And so it's really, really a success. And so a lot of these things you don't hear about, except if you go to a meeting and you say something like that on the stand, and somebody says, oh, that was rude. He shouldn't have said that. But the minute you walk down the hallway afterwards, somebody settles up and says, oh, you think that's bad? Let me tell you the disaster that we had, and there's an enormous number of these examples out there. And they are examples of being a little premature in doing something and just not being careful about it. But if these things are used not as data, but as estimates, then it can be used to do tremendously efficient sampling. And if you're doing efficient sampling, you can afford to do the measurements. And now, of course, you can put them together. You can say, well, I have this information on this plot. Everybody's, oh, golly, well, there's a soil series for it. And there's environmental stuff about it. And the GIS will put that together with your measurements. So there's a chance to get measurements widely and from a lot of people for free that really are measurements, not just guesses. Guesses are overrated, I think.
Yeah. And I wanted to get to that. I recently read your, 2018 paper on LiDAR inventory. And so but I want to build up to that. I want to go back a little bit because, I think prior to variable radius plots, we were all doing, fixed radius plots. That was the standard forest inventory sampling procedure. We might stratify it or something, but that was the standard. This new idea of the variable radius plots came into play. It hit the East Coast, it hit the West Coast. You were there for, much of that. My question for you is, from your side, I would love to hear it from you. Why variable radius plots versus fixed plots?
Well, we're lucky because we have variable radius, because we happen to deal with cylindrical objects. They're cylindrical and in cross section, circular in cross section. Other people don't have that. So there's no point in having variable plots as easily with wildlife or something like that. They're stuck with fixed plots. And they've done them for years, and so they want to do that. When variable plot came along, the managers had all earned their bones under fixed plots. They were about to be put out to pasture, in a sense, because they don't know how these things work. And so they did not want them. No, thank you very much. And it is quite true that most new ideas are a dud. And even when they're true, they're not worth the expense, and they don't end up being that big a deal. Only rarely does something like this come along, which is a stroke of genius and is terribly practical. And in our case, it really is about trees. You can use them in astronomy and a few other things as well, and in certain counting of cells and so on. Basically, it's a forestry thing. So it was new, and people just didn't want to do new things. It put them out to pasture. So the managers didn't want it, and they had to die off. And like many things, and physicists have a saying that the process of physics is at the rate of funerals. You have to get rid of the guys that simply will not think differently, will not accept things. And so there was that hesitation because it was a big change. And that would have happened to plumbers or any other profession. And I'm sure has. It's a normal human situation. And so there was this resistance. Now it's 80 years. It's about time to get over it. And there are no technical problems. But fixed plot is just a special case of variable plot. The logic is not that difficult. They tried to explain variable plot as kind of as fixed plots. And that it didn't work very well. But it was just a natural resistance to change. And you find that in all professions. And I do that. I say, if I talk to clients, I say, no, we don't want to be the first one to try this great new idea. We want to be the third one, after two people have a successful, large scale, cost effective, positive result. Then we try the new idea. Not until then. The pioneers in any business have arrows in their front from the natives and arrows in their back from the people that are trying to take the glory away from them. You don't want to be a pioneer unless you want all the grief. Mm-hmm. So all these things were just human responses. And the problem was that it's a really, really good system. And sooner or later, you've got to get over it. And you have to do a little bit more math, but we now have hand calculators. Mm-hmm. We used to do square roots by hand with a pencil and paper, and our systems were built around that. So when somebody said, oh, well, the trees all have to be computed individually, they're not all multiplied by a 5. This was just too much for people to take. That's going to take forever. Well, nobody's even seen these formulas for a lifetime in some cases. They're in computers. They're simply not a problem. But initially they were. Mm-hmm. And these were real problems, real limitations of the day of the 1950s. But they're long since gone. And all the people who had an argument against them, they're all dead. They've all grown up and are deceased. So now, not to use variable plot sampling is just absurd. Yeah. Well, maybe for little plots, small sense. And if the trees stop being circular, then it would make a little bit less sense. But even in general, you can do it. So I don't know why people kept resisting it for as long as they did. And it was a great mystery to Walter Bitterlich as well. He couldn't figure that out. Lou Grossenwald was the same. What's the matter with you people? I wrote this up. In 1950. Yeah. 1950 is now quite a while ago. It was in a different millennium, for God's sake, and a different century. And they couldn't understand it either. But these were not bad people. It was just a new thing, and they didn't want to rush it. So there was that resistance, and there still is. Now they don't want to do it for permanent sample plots. It's the same problem. And if you have to deal with other people, if you are forced to do a big inventory with lots of other people, with ecologists and soils people and so on, they can't understand variable plot sampling. Mm-hmm. And so they don't want you to do it. Not only do they not want to do it themselves, they don't want you to do it because they just think maybe it's really voodoo and nobody has explained it in a simple enough way that they said, oh, yeah, that's easy. No, that's not really difficult. Yeah. So this resistance is the history of all change, I think, and in all professions. It's not just foresters are stupid. They're just like everybody else. And the same problem in physicists and astronomers, and all the same, I think. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, So you and we come from different parts of the U.S. You've been out on the West Coast, and even in Canada. So I should say different parts of North America. I've spent much of my time in the Southeast, where trees are, short and relatively short, and diameter distributions are relatively narrow, and obviously the species are quite a bit different. So we think about sampling in a different way. When you think about forest sampling, the forest that you picture in your head is much different than the one that I picture. I think that definitely the forest type might have an influence on what you are, thinking about sampling. For example, pine plantations in the Southeast is not much different from growing annual crops of corn, right? It's a little bit longer of a rotation, but we plant them in rows and we thin them out, and it's quite a bit different than forestry in the Pacific Northwest, for example. I just wanted to comment on, a piece of your book. I think it was George Furnival who was telling you about you only need to measure the bottom 1/3 of the stem. And in his mind, the bottom 1/3 of the stem, you could just measure it like this. And you said, well, it doesn't work out here. So.
Yes, it was. I was asked to give a talk involving one of George's sampling systems, and I said, well, I want to talk about it. George Furnival's the guy who did that. Well, we want you to do it. So I went to George. Said, well, is there anything you particularly want me to be sure I say? And you say, well, yes, Kim, I want you to say. I think it's important to point out that most of this measures the bottom 1/3 of the tree. So I said, okay. So I gave the talk, and I went back later and I said, well, George, is that okay with you? Everything's, damn it, Kim. He says, I only asked you to do the one thing. You were supposed to say it's in the bottom 1/3 of the tree. Yeah. I said, George, I did say that. Another fellow said, didn't I say? Yes, he did. He said, what the point, Kim, was that since it's in the bottom 1/3 of the tree, you can just reach up and measure it with calipers. And I said, well, George, I'm sorry that I did that, but if we walk out here in British Columbia and we look at the bottom 1/3 of the tree, that's well above what you can reach, George. And so when he was out here one time, I took him up to the big trees on Vancouver Island, which are honking big trees. They're 3 meters in diameter, 15 feet. And I had him stand by the tree. I had to take 3 pictures to get him in the tree and the rest of the tree. And so, yes, that is different. The plantation issue, we were in Chile doing a short course there. And they said, well, we don't use the variable plot system because it doesn't work in the Southern Hemisphere. And, like the angle had flipped over when you crossed the border. So we said, well, we're going to do that. So we took them out and we did a series of variable plots, and we got the answer, and it was bang on what they had. And it was just what we told. It was going to be about 30 square meters. It's going to take this time. The V bar is this much, variability in relation to the tree count, and it's going to be fine. And we got the right answers. They said, oh, you got the same answers we did. Yes, we did. Yeah. But we took 4 days to do this work, and you took a half a day. Yes, I said, that's true. And this was in plantations. So there's more variation in the basal area of trees in plantations than is generally given credit for. Mm-hmm. But if it works, if a system works better for you, or if you're just more comfortable and want to spend the money, there's nothing wrong with fixed plots. They're not wrong. They're like many things in sampling. They're not wrong. They're just kind of expensive. And we spend all kinds of money in forestry to make people happy and to make them comfortable. Yeah. And the credibility is very important in forest inventory. So if somebody says, well, my boss will not believe anything but a fixed plot, I said, well, do the fixed plot. Mm-hmm. Make your boss go do the fixed plot and he'll change. Mm-hmm. But he's not going to do the fixed plot. He's going to make you suffer. So you're getting paid for it. So just suffer.
I think we find in certain timber types where the ultimate point that I'm trying to get at is that they probably each have their place. For some people, the variable plots might be the best thing, but I think they have their place. I'll give an example. In bottomland hardwoods, you might have a tree that is just so far away and it's big enough diameter that you're just never going to see it. That's bottomland hardwoods in the Southeast are traditionally that way. That diameter distribution can be quite skewed. And so whenever you do variable radius plots, it's not necessarily that the system itself is bad. It's just more of the forester's ability to see those trees out, big giant trees out past other trees, which could be 100 feet away from the point center. Yeah.
We have giant trees here. We have trees with a small BAF that are in at 100 meters away.
Right. Right.
So you don't use that big an angle.
Right.
You keep the sample size down, and you don't have that problem. There are a few people, particularly in Europe, that say, well, I'm worried about the long ones, so we're not going to use them for the big ones either. The really big ones, we'll use a fixed plot. And say, well, how do you reach them with a fixed plot? Well, we don't. We have a small fixed plot.
Right.
So we don't catch those. Well, okay. So how's that different than using a wide angle that gives you small circles? They're circles around trees.
Right.
So the mechanical problem is not really a technical problem. It's an emotional problem. The Canadians, when they first looked at variable plot sampling, decided they were a long ways away, and sometimes you couldn't see them. For some reason, you could see them with fixed plots. Well, because you have little trees in between. When you stopped doing that stupid thing, and got down a tree count that was reasonable, around 6, and if you can't get 6 trees in, and we have occasions where you can't see really well at all. We have Solal on the West Coast that is as bad as anything gets except the jungle. And it's almost as bad as that, in which case you get an average tree count of 1 or 2. Yeah. Or on occasion, like in the jungle, nothing works in the jungle. You just put in a fixed plot if you have to. But in every other situation, I've never seen a situation where fixed plot made more sense than doing variable plots if you're doing them intelligently.
Yeah,
the geometry is just superior, but there's not like either one of them is wrong. And if you want to spend the extra money, and particularly if you're the person who suffers, go do it.
Well, I've definitely seen some fixed plots that made people suffer. So
yes. The students are often quite variable plot, fixed plots, all the same. Well, no, you go out and do it for 6 months, and you will quickly figure out that it is not the same. And neither of them is wrong. I always say, if you need the height of a tree, you could, and some people do, climb the tree and drop a tape down and measure the height. It's not wrong to do that, but it's stupid in most cases. But if you want to do it, some of the big tree people do that. And it's so exciting because they like climbing the tree. That's really fun. If you want to do it, that's fine. But we have geometry and we have, trig, and we know how to do these things in other ways. So I've never seen a situation where a fixed plot was superior, except for little trees.
Yeah.
But if your boss insists on it, well, you just do it. And I think everybody ought to do a month of fixed plots. And at that point, you have a different view of life. And like many experiences, nothing is quite the same after you've seen that.
The way that we do forest sampling in the Southeast is pretty cookie cutter. A lot of fixed plots. Again, I think they have their uses, but where I want to be schooled on is from a person with your expertise in sampling. So how we traditionally do forest inventory in the Southeast and probably other parts of the world, we have our inventory, we get our plots, we work up the crews at a stand level, and then that crew's information stays in a database. That goes in one database. It's the worked up stand level crews. Whenever we want to get a forest value or do management planning, we then project the stand inventory using models from that aggregated stand level compile. Now, it seems from a sampling standpoint that the plot itself is the sample unit. So should we not indeed be projecting from the sample unit instead of the compiled crews? That's the question.
Well, it seems to me that you got a little bit more information in that. You have a variability, you have particular instances, and it seems to me that has to be, since there is more information there, it has to be slightly superior.
Yeah.
And the real question with all of these situations is, well, I mean, let me see if I got this straight. I mean, you're a modeler. Mm-hmm. You put in a plot. You're worried about projecting stand volumes eventually, or forest volumes. The plot is 15% off to begin with. Is that a good thing? If somebody said, well, heck, why don't I fix that for you? Why don't I take that description and just change the number of trees per acre in order to give you a better volume? Wouldn't that be an advantage? And individual plots are more variable. They're wronger on an individual basis.
Right.
But it seems to me, just philosophically, it seems to me that projecting original information in its original form with its original characteristics just has to be a little bit better. So we then project 15 individual plots to get an answer rather than one average per acre for the whole stand. It just seems to me like that ought to be a little bit better. So the question is, well, is it 1% better or is it 27% better? Now, if you show me something, I'm not interested in a simulation. Right. You show me that with real data, and I'm willing to be convinced. If what you get is a much better result, well, yeah, sure, do it. Do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah. And again, I think it's going to be the variability of the stand that matters. I mean, when we sample, you mentioned earlier, measurements versus estimates. We are measuring trees, we are measuring diameters, we are estimating everything else. And so those are estimates. Whenever we blow those estimates up, they don't necessarily follow the normal distribution of our measurements.
And they do not.
Yeah. And
not necessarily, they just do not. Well, and so are these things a big problem or a small problem? If they're a small problem, take whatever suits you. If it's a big problem, then you got to have to make a difference. And so I think that that the nearer you are to working with original data, the better you are philosophically. Is that worth the cost? If somebody comes along and says, well, now look, Mickey, you're a nice guy, but you're working with 150 plots. I've got 2,000 plots. I can tell you what the volume is out there.
Right.
Take your plots, reduce or increase them so you get my better volume and grow that. I think that would be superior. Having the detail is a good thing. Making sure the detail gives you a very good estimate is a very, very good thing.
Yeah.
I really object to people they take a bad sample, they take bad measurements, they get an answer from it, and then they say, well, we've got to grow this original answer, to 7 decimal places. Yeah. I don't think so. George Furnivall once said, he says, George was always saying smart things, and I don't know where he said this, but I remember it vividly. He said, there's 3 things in forest inventory. You get the total. I don't care how you get that. That's one thing. An entirely different issue is you distribute that total. This is the total for the United States. Well, I want it by city. I want it by stand. I want it by small area. You distribute it. That's a different thing. Nothing to do with the total. The distribution is a different issue. And the third thing is, since he was a growth guy, he said, where's it going? So what do you got? Where is it? And where is it going? Those are the 3 issues, and they are separate issues. So if somebody says, well, look, I've got the volume of the United States to within a 0.25%, and you're going to grow something and you're going to do a model, you do whatever you want, you gather whatever you want, but you make sure that your total matches my total, which is good. And then if you want individual items to make up that total, then the cheapest, easiest thing is to change their frequency. Okay, you have 1 tree per acre. Well, let's say it's 0.96 trees per acre. Can you do that? And you should be able to do that. So that way you can adjust the total to a righteous total. You might as well start at the right place.
Yeah.
Overall, certainly, individually if possible, and then grow that with the best stand description that you have, which hopefully is from there, or at least is a good estimate of what is there.
Right.
I think that's the way to look at this problem.
Yeah.
And I don't think we've done that well in the last few decades.
Yeah.
But I do know this for sure. If you're starting with an answer that's 15% off, you're not getting a good modeled answer.
Right. Right.
And if you need data to do that, get data, but make sure that data adds up to the right starting point. Those are two different things. And I think they're an important difference. And people have been too wrapped up with saying, well, this is the data, and I just have to work with that. No, you don't. You have oodles, as we said before. You were inundated with information trying to give you what you need. Get the total some way really well, and then make sure that the parts add up to that total.
Yeah.
The FIA, of course, these days is used for getting totals for a whole state, for instance. And maybe it's good for a whole state, but maybe somebody else has got 10,000 plots and they've got a really good answer. Well, fine, take that answer and then take whatever you're doing, adjust it to that well-known answer by changing perhaps the frequency of the numbers of trees per acre in your data set, and then grow it forward from a good answer.
Yeah.
Am I answering your question here?
Yeah, you are. I mean, it's I guess it's a problem that we are, I say just now, but in recent times incurring because of our ability to store data. So I've had some of the biometricians from Weyerhaeuser on the podcast who have discussed that, they didn't actually store inventory data. They stored the predicted parameters of the gamma distribution to predict their diameter distributions. So 2 or 3 values instead of a whole, inventory. But now we have.
But never because it was a good idea, because it was necessary to do it that way.
Right.
And if you look at it, we're doing this thing because it's necessary. A lot of people can't do something because it's necessary. They have to believe that it's a good idea.
Right.
You get this problem now with cameras. There are people saying, well, they should use film, and people are starting to sell film cameras anymore under the view that, well, somehow film is right. Well, film was never a good idea.
Yeah.
It was always a dog. And thank God it's gone. Yeah. But you had to do it at one point. So if you had to do it well. Yeah. Do it the best you can. But the minute that thing no longer becomes necessary, leave it behind and go on to something. Yeah. And so when people were able to use, for instance, titles for things in computers that had more than 4 digits, they kept the 4 digits. And you ask, well, why? Yeah. Well, we've always done it this way. No, you did it that way because there was a limitation, and the limitation is gone. Stop doing the stupid things because of limitations that aren't there anymore. I mean, that's your point. It's no longer a problem. It's a choice.
Right.
So let's make an intelligent choice. Which is the intelligent choice? Well, let's ask that question.
These kind of questions, while they are classic, I mentioned earlier that I had previously read your paper in 2018. You wrote a paper for the journal that I cannot name, Chris Krzyzewski's journal, that you talked about using LiDAR in forest inventory. And I'm curious to get your thoughts, not just on LiDAR, but, one of the things you talk about is the difference of measurements versus estimates. What we're seeing now, you have a couple of different camps, but you got ones that are saying, oh, we can get a wall-to-wall inventory with LiDAR. Or we're seeing another side of it where we're using some kind of sensor, whether it be on a drone or a backpack or whatever, and people are actually doing traditional forest sampling, putting in plots. With the difference being that instead of actually measuring, they are now estimating those forest or tree characteristics from the sensors in whatever the mode of transportation is, whether it be a backpack or a drone or a Boston Dynamic dog or whatever, 4-wheeler driving through the woods, whatever. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on, because you're in this, variable sampling versus fixed plots, and then seeing where we're going. Where do you think forest sampling is going to ultimately land? Do you have an idea for that?
Well, heaven knows. So much of it isn't a technical issue.
Yeah.
It's a psychological issue. It's an organizational issue.
Right.
Fixed plots is more general. Variable plots are more general than fixed plots. Fixed plots are a special case. When you go to a general case, you just got to have an improvement.
Yeah.
But it also has to be acceptable. And a certain number of generations have to die off before somebody says, well, look, just work it out. Okay. Of course this works. Now, I've been through about 10 or 12. You're putting me on a spot here about the sampling issue with the remote sensors. I've been through about 12 versions of this remote sensing is going to be the answer. We will never go to the woods again. We need never measure anything. Everything will be fine. And they've all failed. And LiDAR is kind of cresting now, and it's going down. Next is going to be FODAR, and there will be something after that. But all of them failed. And they failed for a philosophical reason. What you can get with remote sensing is an estimate. That is enough to get. It is extremely valuable. It's good for designing your sample and therefore getting a good total. So it meets George's issue of number one, get a good total. Two, however you get it, I don't care if you get it by Ouija board, it's good for distributing that sample. And so you could say, well, suppose you have this magic stuff. Suppose we have not LiDAR, but something which gives us bark thickness. It gives us bark thickness on all the trees. Imagining and we have a map. Now, what have we got? We've got GPS. That's useful. Wall-to-wall things by a computer, that's useful. Okay. Estimates, that's useful. Got nothing to do with LiDAR. All those things are really useful. What? To design an inventory to get a good total. And secondarily, to take that good total and disperse it. So if somebody says, well, the bark thickness here is different by 10% than the bark thickness there. Well, let's adjust our estimates by 10% as well. Don't change them overall. We keep them the same. But the dispersion now is done with much greater efficiency. And you can use this with LiDAR, FODAR, radar. Any of the R's, you can use it, fix them, use them all. I don't care, but you do not get to change the total. The total has to be based on a sample. But all the other stuff as auxiliary information is extraordinarily handy. And I think that if remote sensors who have traditionally failed at huge expense in this matter would stop trying to do forest inventory and help do inventory design and inventory dispersion, they would be extremely successful. And they don't have to measure a single thing, and they can't. So if you stop trying to do something you can't do, you might just end up being really, really useful. And they're not ready to hear that yet. And that's, I think, why you put me in this position of saying this instead of saying it yourself, which is okay.
I haven't been in the game long enough to see as many as you, but of course I hear, I work in consulting. I hear every time there's a new fad, I hear, oh, this again, So,
yes.
It's great. And it's one of those things that we don't seem to learn from history. It's always the next guy at MIT or Berkeley or whoever has come up with the way to revolutionize forest inventory. It's like, well, we've kind of already done that. I guess the concern, and you see this in other parts of the world, Europe, mostly, that the cost of people gets so expensive that doing forest inventory, boots on the ground inventory, just becomes cost prohibitive. And, as a consultant, we would worry that, clients would be willing to forego inventory because it's too costly and just kind of shoot from the hip, which happens. So, but does it get too costly that it happens more often? And in those cases, you're going to make more errors in your inventory estimate. You're going to end up basically with more lawsuits, which hopefully could be written off. Oh, you told us to do this.
Well, I enjoy also. I've been doing a lot of expert witness testimony in the last couple of years, and I enjoy the legal procedure. It's horrible. Everybody loses, mind you, but it's technically very interesting. Right. And I remember a comment that was made once by I'm trying to be discreet here, by a person in forest inventory for whom I have almost no respect. None.
Okay.
Is still in the 1930s at best, and is just I've come up against him in court. He loses terribly. No respect. On the other hand, we were sitting around in a giant hot tub at a meeting one time. And since I was there, I'm listening to this guy tell his stories. And he said, I don't know what the background was. He said, and these guys, he said, they didn't even have an inventory. They had takeover blinking out of their foreheads. And I thought, that's better than anything I've ever said. That's just absolutely perfect. It may be that I don't like the rest of it, but by God, he got that exactly right.
Yeah.
And we can't afford to do the bookkeeping, for the taxes. We can't afford to do the safety thing. We can't afford really to have insurance. We can't afford these things. If you do it intelligently, inventory is not that terribly expensive. Mm-hmm. And the expensive parts of it are often because we insist upon putting in thousands of plots when a couple dozen would do. Mm-hmm. Because the problem with inventory is dispersion far more than it is total. FIA gives us a good total of volume in the United States. Now they have inventory problems with quality control, quite apart from that. Mm-hmm. The numbers of plots are sufficient. After a couple hundred plots, nothing changes in terms of the total. It's the distribution that changes. So if you use other things for distribution, you get all the benefits without very much cost. And in some cases, some of these benefits are virtually free. Mm-hmm. Computers do them at nighttime. You don't even need the lights on. And LiDAR and things like that can do that, but they cannot do the measurements. Right. They get something called height. It's not really height. When you check it, well, they can't really do it. They don't need to. What they need to do is say there's more here relative to what's there. Mm-hmm. And so whatever your number, which you get from real measurements and from real samples and that can be dispersed now with great efficiency. Mm-hmm. And even getting the number can be more efficient when we use it in the sampling scheme. The measurements are not that expensive. It's substituting measurements for good sense that's expensive, I think. Mm-hmm. And I think there are plenty of disasters to show that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. I get called into a lot of situations to remedy disasters of various kinds. And I often find that they have way, way, way too many plots, and they don't trust any of the data because they've taken a bunch of shortcuts. Yeah. And the first 100 plots were all they needed. And the rest of them were just done because they wanted to look like they were working hard. Mm-hmm. And it didn't occur to them that they were working on an area where they just bought. They just took over a company. There was a perfectly good inventory there before, but it was the wrong volume table to their mind. It was the wrong specs, et cetera, but the relative amounts were very good. Mm-hmm. So why aren't they using the measurements and correcting them to get a good total and dispersing it based on the former information? There was no reason not to. Yeah. They throw everything away, start all over, put in 10,000 plots, which they don't trust because the last 2,000 were all faked, mm-hmm. and put next to the road because it was way too expensive to go, up there. Yeah. So, that's just a sampler's viewpoint on these sorts of things. Sampling is not that difficult, mm-hmm. and it's not difficult to do it effectively.
Right.
And so if you do it intelligently, you don't need that much of it. Right now, we measure for variable plot sampling something like 6 or 8 or 10 times as many trees as we need to. Mm-hmm. What's the problem? Getting a good basal area is the problem. You do that with the counts. No measurements necessary. Diligence, you need to be diligent, but you don't need to be all that bright to count trees bigger than your thumb.
Right.
And the basal area is the variable part. Yeah. Work on the cheap, easy variable part, get the total good, and then disperse it in terms of products and so on by the measurements on the trees. And by the way, now that you're only measuring a fifth as many of them, why don't you measure them well, mm-hmm. instead of estimating the diameter and estimating the height and so on? Now, you've put me on a spot to say that, but we'll let your listeners decide whether I had anything to offer in that matter.
I think it makes sense. And so if you connect it to what I was saying, so the problem is that people are becoming more and more expensive. Well, the solution for that isn't throw the people away. It's find a way to sample more efficiently, essentially.
Yes. And just about all the sampling systems we're using are are generations old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, tens of Grossenball was doing things better than we're doing them now 70, 80 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we've not noticed.
Yeah.
And you look on ResearchGate, people are very excited. They've discovered systematic sampling. They're all excited about that. They've discovered using auxiliary data. Oh, this is just the newest, best thing in the world. All of these are very old ideas.
Mm-hmm.
We just need intelligent applications of them.
Yeah.
In almost all cases, almost all my experience, we've had too many plots put in incorrectly and put in which stresses the budget, so we can't do the work right.
Mm-hmm.
This is typically the case. And we have now extremely useful things for auxiliary data and for the dispersion of a known total.
Mm-hmm.
Those things have increased massively. The problem is they keep trying to do those things to get the total, and they can't do that well.
Mm-hmm.
So get the total some other way. Separate the two. George had it right. Total is one thing. Separate thing entirely is the distribution of that total. Get the total intelligently, and then get the distribution intelligently. When you separate them, you can do that. If you don't separate them, you have lots of problems.
Mm-hmm.
But those aren't technical problems. Those are easy, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I may be wrong. And if I'm wrong, that'll be okay. That's a self-correcting thing. You know, as in the physicists, I'll die soon, and nobody will be bothered with that opinion.
Right.
But I don't see anything that they're doing that's a fundamental improvement. And they've suffered from this in remote sensing forever. These are smart people. Mm-hmm. And they have on their hands very nice tools that they're using very foolishly. Mm-hmm. The minute they stop trying to do something they can't do, they'll very likely be very successful. And they've got the computer operations to do that. They've got the scanning capability. They've got GPS to find positions. They can go out there and do their estimates all over, form some sort of fuzzy, lumpy thing, greenish thing, distinguished by a circle. And when they do that very well, they've got the placement already. And then somebody just needs to be told, look, you need to go out and find out what's in those individual fuzzy lumpies, because I got 8,743,206. Give or take one or two. If somebody could just tell me what's in them, and I know where they are by GPS. I have not made a single measurement. And now I've got a very effective design, and I know where things are. Just tell me what's in them. And if the answer is 1.07 trees, I've got the number of trees in Alaska in no time at all.
Right.
At least that's the way I see the problem. I think that's the way it will shake out.
Yeah.
If logic prevails, and it won't happen soon. It'll take a generation to get there, I think.
Yeah, I think we're, again, in that paper that you wrote in 2018, you're talking about the overfitting essentially to the LiDAR data, which is, they're basically throwing machine learning and AI models at everything now. And while our data sources are becoming bigger and bigger, we're getting more and more data that we can store. I don't know necessarily that we have the same kind of big data sets as other industries have. But the problem is the overfitting. So you get your LiDAR data set and you fit your models, as you mentioned in your paper, and then you take that LiDAR model and apply it to LiDAR on a different property where that machine learning methods weren't fitted. And then all of a sudden it doesn't work. It breaks down. Why doesn't it work? Probably because you had too much data and too many variables. And, if it was a good model, it would have been on its own, right?
And why do you need that? In many cases, getting the estimates in their proportions correct is 95% of the problem. You then just need to adjust it. Right. And for that, you need measurements.
Right.
And they've just been concentrating on the wrong thing. There's a long history of a disaster in remote sensing about, we're going to do, field calibration. And it's always a disaster. And when you talk to the people that do it, if you talk to the designers, everything is fine. Yeah. If you talk to the funders, of course, everything was a success. If you talk to the poor schmuck out in the woods who checked it, it's a disaster. But you don't need to do it. The dispersion is the major issue. And that's what remote sensing can and should, and I believe will, eventually do. The measurement portion, it can't do worth a darn.
Yeah.
And I think it should just give that up. But if they did that portion of it, they would be an enormous success. They just can't stop trying to have some fantasy and calling it tree volume.
Yeah.
I think it's a mistake to try. But it's so compelling. Say, well, look, we have these beautiful pictures and all these colors, and we can make them rotate. It's just so exciting, and it is. It is exciting. It's just, the public relations aspect of it is wonderful. But if you look at the disasters, they're less impressive, or so it seems to me from my experience.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to spend the whole time talking about bright orange sampling, because we have quite a few other topics to cover. But
in my defense, you did provoke me.
It's my fault, because I'm also a nerd. I just have a feeling some people are going, "Oh, I'm still talking about sampling." So, but one of the things that I am going to be tasked with in my lifetime as a biometrician is starting to integrate sampling methods from these remote sensing techniques. It's going to happen. And so I've been trying to wrap my mind around it. And it was funny. I was talking with Mark Ducey at the NEMO SOMINS meeting. And I was telling him, like, Mark, we're moving to a full census of the data. And he said, "No, Mickey, you're getting a false census." And I was like,
yes.
Yeah, bingo. Yeah, you kind of nailed it on the head for me there. But I don't think it's so unheard of. Well, I know it's not, because I've heard of it, that people would move to a complete false census of their forest and work with, modeling individual estimates of trees, not measurements of trees. So I think that's not necessarily that's going to be the ultimate solution, but I think it's coming, and pretty sooner rather than later for me. So
yes, I think so. Once you split, getting the total and distributing that total, then this becomes very, very, very easy to do. And I think we have such an avalanche of information that we cannot help but do really well at dispersing data. And once we get it very local, I mean, if you say, well, I got my choice. I can take a plot and I can be up to 30 or 40% off, or I can take some vague thing and I know exactly where all the pseudo trees are. And if you can calibrate that within 5% as a starting point, I really can't lose by very much.
Yeah.
I mean, how badly can you project a volume that's within 1 or 2% to begin with? And you're not going to get that 1 or 2% from the plot. You're going to do that by adjusting that plot up or down to a total which is correct, but is dispersed efficiently.
Yeah.
And that's quite doable if you could get anybody to stop what they're doing now and try and do that.
Yeah, I think they need somebody like you to tell them to do that, though. I mean, it's not something that I have even thought about, but when you say it, it makes perfect sense. Like being able to distribute it amongst the stand or the forest or whatever it is, that makes a lot of sense. And you sent some wheels spinning that now I'm going to go look into that a bit more. So hopefully the remote sensing people watch this podcast and will hear what you said and take it.
No, I hope they don't. They don't. The problem is not my experience in more than 50 years as a forest biometrician is that these problems are not that hard to solve. They are hard to sell. They are hard to accept. Those are psychology problems, which are very much more serious and very difficult to solve. But the technical issues are not a problem. There's no problem using variable plots for long-term permanent sample plots. There's no problem using it for lots of these things. The problem is to say, how do I look at this? How do I explain it to somebody who doesn't want to listen, who is from a background who doesn't believe that anybody but ecologists have ever had a good idea of anything, or somebody, who's a chemist who says, well, if you were smart, you'd have been a chemist. Why would I listen to anybody who isn't smart? Those are the serious problems. The technical problems are normally not difficult, but they are difficult to sell. They're sometimes difficult to hear, and they for sure take decades, in some case lifetimes, to change.
Mm-hmm.
But they do change. We've given up on Newton. Einstein was more right. It's not quite sure whether Einstein had it perfect, but eventually the physicists will die who insist upon, the guys who were in Newton's, they're gone. They're all dead. Now the guys who have said, well, Einstein had it right, they're going to have to die. And then we're going to have quantum mechanics, and then there'll be something else. And that's from people trying to be serious and careful. They're not being stupid. They're just being careful.
Yeah. So I think, for me, and again, you are a super history buff. I know at least in the forestry world, maybe outside of that as well. I'm not sure, but I have a feeling, as you've mentioned a bit, we're losing a bit of our history. You're talking about things that Rosenbaum was doing 50, 60, 80 years ago. But then we get back to the literature these days, and actually the literature, what we call the literature, is just massive and massive amounts of publications. And, I've read your criticism of some prominent forest science books, but I think the problem is that we're getting bogged down. So if you look over the past 10, 15 years, what percentage of the work was actually meaningful? A lot of it is just repeats of what has already been done. It's same methods being applied to a different forest type or whatever. If you look at modeling, I interviewed Kwong Kao, professor of biometrics at LSU. He said, we've hit the upper asymptote of modeling. We're not going to have better models at this point. All of the good stuff has already been done. And, that's interesting hearing him say that, which he's a bit pessimistic sometimes anyway. But I'm just curious, and not necessarily from a modeling standpoint, but from a sampling standpoint, since that's your specialty. Where do you see, do you think we're going to have any major breakthroughs? Is this amounts of data going to give us something new? Or is it the math is the math? We found it. We just got to figure out how to make it more efficient, as we've already said.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's my opinion that we don't need anything new.
Yeah.
The stuff we have perfectly adequate,
Mm-hmm.
and we're getting new ways to apply it all the time. There are small differences. Some of the sampling techniques are about finding the probability of detecting something,
mm-hmm.
which are terribly interesting, and they're innovative,
mm-hmm.
and they're thoughtful, they're clever, but it's still Hansen Hurwitz. The math is pretty much statistics we haven't gotten anything we need yet, but we have different ways to get to it. We've always known that when you have a total, you have to guess what the parts of your inventory are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we didn't have that remote sensing always. We didn't have GPS always. Those things are new. They help those applications become efficient and cost effective, sometimes fast. But you just don't know. Yeah. I mean, where did variable plot sampling come from? I mean, it's so weird.
Where it came, right? You went to the forest where Dr. Bitterlicht was standing when he thought about it.
Yes. And I asked him one time. Walter was always kind of thinking about something while he was talking to you. He knew he was multitasking, and so he was just talking to you because you were so slow. I said, "Sir, could you tell me how you thought of variable plot sampling?" I thought of it as being circles and. Yes, he said. Well, it was more complicated than that, and it is difficult for me to explain. And he stopped. In other words, I don't think you're bright enough to understand what I'd have to tell you here, and so why don't we just let it go? And so I said, well, of course, sir. And I was sitting in a plaza in Spain once, looking at a bunch of tiles that were hexagons and thinking about this, and suddenly remembered a picture that he had in his book, and I figured out how he really did it. And it really was quite strange. It was hard to believe that anybody would have thought of such a thing. And these occasionally you get something which is really an original thought, and they seem to come from out of nowhere and from no base. In Poland one time, the editor for Science, Ed Green, at the time, was asked by places, what was the most interesting thing that you've seen in forest science in like a long time? And he said, well, it was sector sampling, technical. He said, and so the guy said, well, and why that? He said, because it came out of nowhere. It was a new idea with no background, nothing to refer it to. It was just weird and out of nowhere. And those things happen every once in a while. And so I can't predict if anything like that would happen. We'll get we've got Walter Bitterlicks right now at age 20. They're out there, but will they get the right background, the right mentors, a job that will allow them to do that work? Maybe a world war that they have to sit through while they're thinking about it. There has to be a magic sequence of things that happens to people who are relatively bright, or in his case, a genius, that suddenly they come up with these new things. So I just don't know what's going to happen. But I don't see anything on the horizon. If you're asking me that, no. I think that we have plenty of things that we can do, and lots of ways to solve these problems. Most of our problems are organizational and psychological.
I enjoyed a quote from your book where you said, something about to be an efficient crew supervisor, you got to be knowledgeable of industrial psychology or something to that effect.
When I started teaching at the social science, the psychology department, they asked me to do this as a favor. It's a long story, but I finally did it. And so the dean said, there's some concern, you're a forester and this is psychology and statistics. I said, look, I do consulting. 95% of my work is in industrial psychology and 5% is statistics. And the statistics part is dead simple. So yes, I think I can teach this to psychologists if they'll listen. And they turned out to be great kids, and they did listen. But I think it's important to remember that this business of people believing things and feeling comfortable is extraordinarily important. I don't care if you're right. I don't care if you're smart. I don't care if you're a genius. You still have to somehow drop it down in a way that people will listen to it. Except if you're such a genius as Bitterlich, which he was so right that everybody eventually was just forced to use it. If they could have, they would have said, no, it won't work. There was great, at the time, somebody, well, this can't be right. If it was right, I'd have thought of it. Well, if it is right, it won't be cost effective. And if it is right and cost effective, it's too soon to do it and nobody will allow us to. There was all kinds of reasons, but it was so good that it overcame those. Lots of good ideas have died over the years that were just as good, that just didn't have a better introduction.
Right.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the best I can do with it.
I'm, from a forest history standpoint, I'm obviously very interested in history and the people that have come before me. I had mentioned to you earlier that I read your book. I loved it. I wish we had more of this, more of understanding of people and who they were. We're going to miss, the next generation especially is going to miss a lot of that. And it's your book that's, something like that is going to help keep those people alive. But as I mentioned to you, I'm curious because the Southeast biometricians were obviously not very well represented in your book, and maybe just because that's of where you were located in BC. But I also just last week had heard, and I did not know this, that the Southern Mensurationists, the SOMENS meeting, used to be like closed door, like an exclusive group, like they went in, shut the door, and nobody talked about what happened there. So I'm just curious from your perspective, being involved in the Western Mensurationists and Nemo, what was it like back then? What did you think about us Southern biometricians?
Well, they became academic, they became exclusive. It was by invitation only, and they died.
Yeah.
And they died for lack of innovation and lack of people wanting to listen. The Western Mints was easy.
Mm.
We started out by being just a little room that was put on in the Western Conservation Association. They were basically a fire group, and they would meet when they weren't burning. So it was in, like November or something. And they said, well, there are all these foresters that are coming, practical guys, managers, people who might use something if it made sense. Why don't you guys take a room and give some talks about useful things in forest measurements? And we said, okay. Johnny Bell was basically the start of that. And that's what they did for years. And all these people would show up who were practical people wanting to find out practical uses that were new. And so it was very effective. And they asked really good questions, which is always the problem in a racket like ours. It's not to get the answers. The answers are relatively easy. It's the questions that are really hard to come by, and which as individuals, we're no good at asking ourselves. I'm no good at that.
Yeah.
And so we had all this practical influence, and that kept us on track for a long time. Eventually we said, meeting in November, I remember there was a snowstorm and we were meeting in the bar thinking, this is so stupid. We're never going to do that again. We're going to have it in the summer, someplace pleasant where you could bring your wife, and where we're going to talk in the sunshine. And that was immediately we went from 20 people to 100 and some people. But we tended to get people who were in academia. And the practical folks started to fall off. And so now we're facing the problem ourselves of we are a pretty academic group who's not talking about anything people would probably want to use. And will we survive? Or will we just fold up as being, oh yeah, those guys meet there, but I mean, nobody listens and nobody goes. It takes a strong chairman to say, oh no, we're going to find out what people want to hear about, and then we'll find somebody to talk about it, instead of what do you want to give? What do you want to present as a paper? And you have to say to some people, I'm sorry, we don't have room for your paper, which is occasionally awkward.
Yeah.
And it's very, very hard to get chairmen that will do that. So that kind of thing happens to all groups eventually. They lose their natural advantages and don't fight for the ones that they need to retain.
Yeah.
And the Western menstruations are eventually now having the same problem that the Southerners did, and that all these groups have done. There's the same thing happened. The Midwesterners shut down. The Northeasterners fell apart and then were resurrected by Kershaw at one point. So these are not just statistical problems. They're all, they're psychology department problems. Yeah. And so I think it's not clear to me. Or will we just have somebody will just say, all right, enough of this nonsense. I'm going to invite 20 people and we'll talk about something interesting, and there'll be a new group, perhaps. It's hard to tell how these things will evolve.
Yeah.
But it's important how they're handled. Am I answering your question?
You are. I've been enjoying these combined Nemo Summons meetings that we've been having, because actually for me the interesting part has been seeing what they're doing in the Northeast.
Yes.
I haven't yet been to a Western Mensurationists meeting. I've just never had any reason to go and work for a Western company or a company that holds land in the West. But I've always been told by Guillaume, I can't pronounce Guillaume's last name, but Guillaume is from Toronto. He's always at the Southern Mints meetings, and he's always so friendly. He's always encouraging, like, hey, you got to get out west. Life's just a little bit different out there. And so I've been curious about the dynamics of those meetings.
Yeah, there are interesting people in each of these regions, and there are the same percentage of talent and innovation and good ideas and hard workers. They differ in their orientation a bit. And I think getting around to all of them is a good thing. It's difficult if you're not, if you're like myself and you pay your own way. It makes a lot of difference to go to a meeting that's expensive. Some of them are much less expensive. You can put on an expensive meeting, or you can put on a really inexpensive. The scalers have met every year for a long time here in Idaho, and they have a meeting full of 150 people, all of them working people, all of them telling a good story about something that really works in their area. And the fee for attending the meeting is $40, not several $100s. And it's not an expensive place. You can do that if that's what you want to do. And my view is that I would much rather go to one of those meetings filled with practical people, because that's where you find out good questions. I recently had reason to look at the things that and I've never been paid as a researcher, never, and I don't have to do it for tenure. And so I write, but I still write 30 or 40 papers, some of which are of moderate consequence. And every one of those paintings, every one of those topics, without exception, were because somebody asked me a question that I wouldn't have asked myself. And if I had asked myself, I would have cheated and made it simple because it was too hard to solve. But a friend wants me to solve his problem, I have to solve that problem. If I was getting funded, if I was asking for this, if I just wanted to please the dean with publications, I would have not done those things. And so I was fortunate to be forced by friends who asked questions I wouldn't have thought of to do work which was interesting and in some cases useful. But I wouldn't have done it for myself. I would have wasted my whole career.
The best part of the meetings for me at this point is the coffee breaks. As you going and running down people and saying, hey, nice to meet you. What are you working on? What are you doing? Those sorts of things. And the students themselves are actually quite brilliant. I think something gets lost when you give up and give a technical presentation. But when you talk to them, what are the details of this? What are you getting into? Like, that's what's fun about it. And
yes, and you get the real history of things. You get a different perspective. I've put on meetings, and we're going to have 2 short 15-minute talks, and then a half-hour or 45-minute break. And we'll take 2 hours for lunch. And we'll stop at 4 o'clock or maybe 3 o'clock, and we'll all go to the bar, and then after that we'll all have dinner. And you get these people coming saying, well, I would like to give a talk, and it's really important, for my company to see me giving a talk. And you just have to say, no, we're not going to do that.
Right.
And they take it. And then I had one guy from the Forest Service bitterly complaining that we could have given more talks. And then he didn't like the schedule. And after that came and said, I had such a great time at this meeting. I met all these people. Well, yes, that's because it was designed the way you didn't want it designed. And I think you're absolutely right. And you get something from talking to people individually that you don't get when they're in front. Now, having a few students, having a few people to get a feel of what they're like and whether they're giving you a straight story and what their capability, that's okay to have a guy do that, particularly young people. And they need some experience, but only a little bit of that. If you want the straight scoop, you want to be discussing it over coffee. And many things, for legal reasons, for social reasons, you can't say in front of a group. You don't know who's there. You don't know whose boss is there. And you can't say a lot of things which people might really need to hear. So yes, you're absolutely right about that. I agree 100%.
Yeah. And the meetings are, again, taken over by the academics, and I don't want any of the academics listening to think I'm hating on them. I'm not. I understand you're in a situation. You have students. You want your students to excel. You want them to give presentations. And that's all important, and I get that. But also, if you're planning a meeting, make some time for people to get to talk to each other. That's very important.
And for students to talk to people.
Yeah.
It's very important. And they have to be kicked in the tail and said, no, you don't sit there like a little muskox circle chatting with each other about your also important. No, you go over and talk to him. That guy over there did the inventory of Alaska. He's been around for 40 years. He knows where all the bodies are buried. He's sitting there with an empty chair next to it. Get up, go over there and sit with him, you little twit.
Yeah.
And you have to get pushy about that. You have to do that as a little more gently than that, but they need that. And that's and they need the time to do that and the circumstances in which that's relatively comfortable. For instance, I always thought that you should rearrange all the tables and the chairs every time. Yeah. Otherwise, people sit in the same place, sitting next to the same person.
Yeah.
And they never get there early, so they can say, "Oh yeah, that's so and so. He's one of the top 3 people in the world. I think I could sit by him." They didn't have the choice because they got there after lunch or something. Mm-hmm. So I think that those sorts of social, they have to be demands on people. You will go to the bar. You will go to the dinner. You will show up early before everybody comes in order to find a good seat as a student. Mm-hmm. And if that's uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable going and meeting people. And I've met, virtually everybody in our racket. In my lifetime, I missed R.A. Fisher. A friend of mine didn't. He got him, but I never felt comfortable, going to those people or calling them up. I did it when I was uncomfortable, and it has paid off massively for me. And I've been lucky enough to meet Bitterlick and Furnival and all those guys, all the authors, lots of people overseas. I did miss R.A. Fisher. You would have enjoyed that. My friend met R.A. Fisher.
Yeah.
He was a student in Adelaide. Fisher gets out of Cambridge. He leaves academia. He goes there. So what does he want to do? Well, he wants to talk about statistics and talk to people and do what he always did. That's what a university is about. Mm-hmm. So he had rooms there. They gave him an office, but he had the rooms. And he said, well, everybody come over to my house and we'll sit around and talk about stuff. Mm-hmm. And so the young faculty would go over there and a few students would go. And once in a while, the faculty would go, but the students, they had things they had to date, or they had to have dinner, or they had to have free lunch someplace. And they would not say, well, I'm not going to come to talk to R.A. Fisher. I'm going to go ahead and have a beer. Mm-hmm. And so my friend, Jerry Leach, lived nearby, and they would call him up and say, Jerry, we need some students to make up the numbers. Come on over and sit with R.A. And so he would go. Not always. He said once in a while. I didn't. So ashamed. And so he would go over there and sit and listen to R.A. Fisher. Can you imagine? I mean, what kind of an opportunity is that? And he was so humiliated. He said, oh, God, Kim, it was awful. He said, I was so stupid. I was so young, and I was so inexperienced. I was so unappreciative, and I was an idiot, and I had nothing to say, and little did I understand what he was saying. On the other hand, I was taught the analysis of variance by R.A. Fisher.
Yeah.
And once in a while in my career, I would be up against a reviewer or somebody who would say, well, it's like this. And I would say, well, actually, I asked R.A. Fisher about that directly, and he said such and such. Instant change of the world. He said it was wonderful.
Right.
But he said I was such an idiot. I'm so embarrassed. I had this wonderful opportunity. On the other hand, he was there and I wasn't, which I greatly regret.
Yeah.
Well, the other guys I got to. And I think it's terribly important for young people to learn to be taken up to these people. That over there in the corner, that's Walter Bitterlick. Go sit by him as long as he'll put up with you. And if they're forced to do that, they have a wonderful adventure, but they will not do so on their own. I didn't. I had to be taught that. And even when I offered people that opportunity, they didn't, because they just felt socially inhibited by that. Mm-hmm. And that's something that you have to work at to get over. And you have to have friends who say, hey, go do this.
Right.
Or else.
I think you probably benefited also from having a major advisor to push you a bit to do that as well. I mean, it sounds like they'll really encourage you to go out and meet people. And I have to say, I have the opposite experience. Harold would never tell me to go meet somebody. He left that up to me. So I wish he would have made some introductions a bit better.
You were probably intelligent enough to do it on yourself. I was too stupid. John Bell knew he needed to do that. He didn't give me a choice.
Yeah.
And after I did it a few times, then I learned that, well, these were lovely people. They're well behaved. They're a joy. I once heard that, Lou Grossenbaugh was this, terrible guy. He could chew you up and spit you out. But not unless you were a jerk.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody else, he charmed all. He charmed the cruisers, he charmed the secretaries, he charmed the janitor, as well as the chief operating officer. He was good. He was great with everybody. He was a lovely man, and never made anybody feel awkward. And their wives are even better. And so these are wonderful experiences, but we are not trained, particularly males, are not trained to do these things. And by the time you gain that skill, many of these people will be gone. So you just have to make it a point to say, well, I'm going. With John Bell, I said, at some point, I forget the details. I said, John, who are the top people? Well, he said, Kim, it's like this. In the ladder of biometrics, there's Furnival and Grossenbaugh in the top two rungs, and there's about 10 or 12 empty rungs. And then there's the rest of us all strung out, indicating that I was down at the bottom.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, John. I said, will you help me make a list? And I'll go meet them all. And I still had time at the time. All I missed was Jerry Clutter, who died relatively young. And the day he died, I went into my boss and said, I want to hire Lou Grossenbaugh for a week. And he said, well, why? I said, well, I want to meet him. And he'll come and he'll give us some good advice.
Yeah.
He said, for a week? Yeah. I said, well, the rest of the time we'll go to the bar and we'll take him around to meet people. And everybody in North America on this part of the will all owe us a favor for years. And my boss, who was a sharp cookie, said, right, Kim, write up something that makes a little better excuse than that, but do it. And so we did it. And that was because Jerry Clutter passed away. And I stopped avoiding doing it. And that it was only the good luck, the bad luck in other ways of his death, such that I never met him. He was the only guy on my list that I didn't meet. And then there's R.A. Fisher. That was a bummer.
Yeah.
And I was as nice a guy as Jerry was. I should have met him too. I did, and I missed other people in statistics that I should have gone to meet because I just waited. And while I'm waiting, all these older guys are dying off. So young people like yourself, if you want to meet people, you just have to call them on the phone and say, can I come and visit you? Yeah. And well, of course you can. And all of them have always said in every instance, well, of course you can. You're welcome to come. One of them was a rather major professor, and he said, "You're coming. Well, where are you staying?" So, well, we've got there's a meeting, and I'm staying in the dorm. Oh, I said, I want to stay there. You stay at my house. And like a complete idiot, I said, "Oh, I wouldn't want to bother you, sir." This was Cunha. He did sampling with partial replacement, and he said, "Oh, okay." And so I was sitting eating a sandwich in my dorm room instead of having dinner with Cunha, listening to how everything happened, just because I was inhibited. And I regret that to this day. I don't know how we got on that. You have this tendency to wind me up and turn me loose, and I run around unguided for periods of time. Sorry about that. You'll have to edit this strongly.
No, not at all. I'm not editing anything. But I really have enjoyed the conversation. We're almost 2 hours in. So I want to say you're obviously quite brilliant person, very intelligent, have done a world for sampling in North America. But one of the biggest things that I've learned from you is that the connections to people and going to meet and learn more about people is quite important. So I think passing that on to the next generation might be the most important thing. You are generally going to be good at what you're doing, but make sure you meet people, you make connections. It's those kind of things where innovation occurs. So,
yeah, and start early.
Yeah, start earlier than us. So
no, it would be today.
Well, Dr. Iles, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. And again, much appreciated for everything that you've done for our profession. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for listening. And until next time, bye.